At the end of Main Street, there's a man everyone thinks they know. A quiet old veteran, a scarred shepherd at his heel, and a little house that goes dark by 8. What no one sees is the empty chair at his table, the son he failed, and the granddaughter who walks past him every week without knowing his name. Until one winter night, when God sends fire, a dog, and one last chance to say, "I love you," before the clock runs out. Before you begin, help us grow by subscribing. The afternoon sky over Maple Ridge sagged low and gray, the kind of flat Midwestern clouds that turned the whole town the color of old dishwater. Out behind the small grocery on Main Street, the wind fussed with flattened cardboard boxes and a rattling metal dumpster, carrying the faint smell of rain that might or might not arrive. Walter Briggs shouldered open the back door with a crate of milk in his arms, boots scraping on the cracked concrete as he crossed to the open tailgate of his faded pickup. He moved carefully, not fragile but deliberate, the way of a man who had carried too many things in his life that could not afford to be dropped. At 59, Walter was the sort of man you noticed twice. Once for the red and black plaid jacket he wore almost every day, and again for the quiet way he kept to himself. His shoulders still filled the checkered shirt jacket. Though age had leaned him out, a cream-colored t-shirt softened the lines at his throat, and dark jeans hung straight over worn brown boots. His hair, cut short out of long habit, had gone mostly gray, with white crowding his temples. A crooked nose and a square jaw gave his face a stubborn set, but the brown eyes above them were gentler than the rest of him suggested, ringed with the creases of someone who had squinted into too much bright light and tried too long not to show what hurt. On his left wrist, a battered military watch rode the familiar dip of bone, its scratched face still ticking time with indifferent precision. The watch had crossed oceans and deserts with him. Now, it crossed only the length of Maple Ridge. The nightmares came anyway. In the small rented house at the far end of Maine, where the living room held an old armchair and not much else, he woke some nights with his heart jackhammering, the shadows on the wall too sharp, the echo of remembered explosions fading slowly from his ears. In those moments, before the ceiling came back into focus and he could hear the refrigerator hum and the distant whoosh of a passing car, he knew two things. One was the weight of the watch on his wrist, stubbornly ticking. The other was the soft sound of paws on worn floorboards and the warm press of a body settling beside his chair. Ranger was almost always there before he asked. Not that Walter ever really asked. The German shepherd was 6 or 7 years old now, big-chested under his tan and black coat with a dark saddle of fur along his back and a few faint pale lines where old scars cut through the hair. His eyes were a clear amber, steady and observant, and his ears seemed to catch every shift of sound in the little house. By day, he liked to sprawl near the armchair like a shadow that had decided to stay. By night, when Walter jerked awake and sat breathing hard in the dim light of the television, Ranger would simply lift his head, slide closer, and rest his chin on Walter's knee. It was not dramatic. It was, somehow, enough. Now, in the gray light out back of Grover's grocery, Ranger watched from the passenger seat of the truck, sitting upright on the cracked vinyl bench as if it were a post he'd been assigned. The window on his side was rolled partway down, and his nose twitched at the air, cardboard, oil, the familiar scent of his human sweat beneath the flannel. When Walter set the crate down with a small grunt and straightened, Ranger's tail thumped once, slow and reassuring, against the seat. Walter glanced over almost without meaning to, and the corners of his mouth tugged upward in the barest suggestion of a smile. "Almost done, partner," he said quietly, The words disappeared into the hum of the refrigeration unit, but Ranger's ears flicked in his direction. It was a simple life, the one Walter had settled into. Deliveries for the grocery, a landlord who left him alone as long as the rent came in on time, a dog who asked for nothing more than walks, food, and a place nearby to sleep. Each morning he loaded the truck, checked his list, and set out along a route that had become as familiar to him as any patrol map once had been. He knew where the road cracked, where kids left their bikes in the way, which porches groaned when you stepped on them, and which screen doors slammed hardest. The rhythm of it soothed something in him that years of noise had frayed. Part of that route, most days, took him out of town. Past the church with its peeling white steeple, past the tidy houses giving way to trailers, and then to tilted mailboxes in front of wide, tired fields. On County Road 12, where the land opened and the sky always seemed a size too big, there was a place where the main road stayed straight and a narrower lane slipped off to the right through a stand of cottonwoods. The lane was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. Walter always knew. He knew the exact way the gravel looked where it disappeared into grass, the exact angle of the leaning fence post at its mouth. He knew what lay at the end of that road. A farmhouse, a barn, and more years than he liked to count. He also knew, in the same bone-deep way, how to keep the wheels steady and his eyes on the strip of asphalt ahead. Every time he reached that stretch, something in his chest tightened, a thin wire pulling him sideways. His foot would ease off the accelerator just for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, old images flashed. White siding against a blue sky, the creak of porch boards, a younger man's voice raised in anger he thought was courage. Then he would force his hands to relax on the wheel and press the gas again. In the passenger seat, Ranger would turn his head, look out at the trees, then back at him, giving a soft exhale that could have been nothing at all or could have been the gentlest of questions. This afternoon, he hadn't yet reached County Road 12. He was still in the alley, finishing the last load of milk before the final loop. The air was cool and damp, the kind that sank into his joints, and the low sky made the world feel closer than usual. As he bent to reach for another crate, he heard footsteps coming up the alley. Unhurried, the solid tap of rubber soles on concrete. "Afternoon, Briggs," a voice called, roughened by age but still carrying easily. Walter straightened and saw the mailman coming toward him. The man looked to be in his early 70s, narrow in the shoulders and long in the limbs, like someone who had walked all his weight into his feet over the years. His postal uniform, short-sleeved light blue shirt, darker shorts despite the chill, hung a bit loose on his wiry frame. Thin white hair clung to the sides of his head beneath a navy cap, leaving the top mostly bare and a little pink. His face was cross-hatched with fine wrinkles, especially around his light gray eyes. But those eyes were sharp and a little amused, as if he'd seen most things before and found very little worth fussing over. A well-worn leather satchel rested against his hip, the strap pulling a faint groove into the fabric of his shirt. "Hey, Earl," Walter said, wiping his palms on his jeans more out of reflex than need. "Didn't expect VIP service out back." Earl's mouth curved. "Don't get used to it," he replied. "Just got something needed a signature and figured I'd rather chase you behind Grover's than leave one of those slips you never collect." He dug into the satchel and drew out a single envelope. It stood out against the gray day, thick, cream-colored paper, corners sharp. A printed return address from a law office in a city Walter rarely thought about. In the center, in clean black type, were 3 words he hadn't seen lined up together in a very long time. Walter James Briggs. A small embossed seal in the lower corner caught what little light there was, leaving a dull gleam along its raised edge. "Sign here," Earl said, holding out the handheld pad. "Legal stuff. Could be money, could be trouble. My job's just delivery." Walter scrawled his name, the letters a little tighter than usual, then took the envelope. It was heavier than he expected, dense in his hand. Somewhere behind him, Ranger shifted, claws clicking softly on the vinyl seat as he moved closer to the window. The dog's ears tilted forward, reading the subtle change in Walter's breathing the way other creatures read the weather. He opened the envelope with his thumb, the paper giving way with a soft tear. Inside, folded with careful, indifferent precision, were several pages of typed text. His eyes skimmed lines he didn't fully take in, caught and held by the first phrase that seemed to step off the paper toward him. To Walter James Briggs, sole surviving heir to the Briggs family farm property. The alley seemed to narrow around him. The hum of the refrigeration unit faded to a distant buzz, the damp air thickened, and all at once he was aware of his heartbeat. Hard, too loud, drumming against his ribs, sole surviving heir. Briggs Farm, the road he would not turn down, the house at the end of it, the life he had walked away from and carefully never named. The page trembled slightly between his fingers. Walter kept his eyes on the words, as if looking away might make them truer. From the truck, Ranger watched him, head tilted, amber eyes steady, body tense but still. He didn't know what the paper said, but he knew the way his man's pulse had changed, knew the scent of adrenaline when it began to rise. For a long, thin breath, standing there between the loading dock and the open tailgate, Walter had the uncanny feeling that the past he'd been driving past for years had finally found the map back to him. And he wasn't sure if the ache in his chest was fear of what waited on that old farm road, or the dangerous, unfamiliar flutter of being needed by something he thought was gone. By the time Walter pulled the truck out of the alley, the gray sky over Maple Ridge had begun to dim toward evening. Streetlights blinking on one by one, like tired eyes deciding to stay open a little longer. The envelope lay on the bench seat between him and Ranger, the thick cream paper looking strangely out of place against the cracked vinyl and scattered delivery slips. Walter had folded the letter back into it with careful hands, as if containing the words might quiet them. It hadn't. Even now, as he eased the old pickup onto Main Street and felt the familiar hum of the engine beneath him, the phrase, sole surviving heir, pulsed somewhere at the edge of his thoughts, keeping time with the tick of his watch. Ranger rode in his usual spot on the passenger side, big body balanced easily against the turns, front paws planted and head high. The shepherd's gaze drifted between the windshield and Walter's profile, reading both the road and the man with equal attention. A faint line had appeared between Walter's brows, and his jaw was set in that way that meant he was thinking too hard. Ranger gave a low huff and nudged the envelope once with his nose before settling back. He'd learned long ago that his job wasn't to fix the things that weighed on his handler, only to stay close enough that nothing had to be faced completely alone. They made their stops because that was what the list said to do, and because routine, even on strange days, was still a kind of life raft. At the small blue house on Elm, where the paint peeled in soft curls and the porch had 3 steps that complained with every footfall, an elderly woman waited with her metal walker already parked near the door. She was well into her 80s by the look of the thin white hair curled close to her scalp and the delicate skin mapped with age spots on her hands. But her eyes were sharp as she watched the truck pull up. Walter carried her groceries to the door, setting the bags carefully on the little table she kept just inside. Ranger hopped down from the truck the moment he saw her, tail swaying in an easy arc. He knew this house. He padded up the walk and, without jostling the walker, sidled close enough for the woman to rest a hand on his head. "Hello there, soldier," she crooned, her voice thin but warm as her fingers sank into his fur. "You looking after this grump for me?" Ranger leaned into the touch, eyes half closing, and let his tail beat a gentle rhythm. Walter almost smiled. "He's union," he said mildly. "Only works certain houses." "It's the good houses," she replied, giving Walter a look that saw more than he liked. "You take care, Walter. Weather's turning." He nodded, thanked her, and walked back to the truck. Ranger hopped up and turned to watch until the door closed behind her, as if confirming she made it safely inside before allowing himself to face forward again. At the duplexes near the edge of town, a knot of kids spilled out the moment they saw the truck. The smallest of them still in mismatched socks, the tallest already gangly with the first stretch of adolescence. They barely noticed Walter beyond a quick hi and a grab for the bags their mother had paid for. Their attention was all for the dog. "Ranger!" the youngest squealed, sticky hands reaching. The shepherd lowered himself slightly, posture softening. His tail swept steadily as two sets of small fingers patted his back and curled in his fur. He stood still, patient, eyes cutting once to Walter for quiet confirmation before he allowed one child to briefly wrap arms around his neck. When a ball bounced too close to the street, Ranger's ears flicked toward the traffic, body tensing for a heartbeat. Walter watched too, breath held, until one of the older kids scooped the ball up without incident. Only then did both man and dog let their shoulders drop. "All right, let him breathe," Walter said gently, not unkind. And the kids reluctantly backed off. Ranger gave one last nudge to the smallest child's hand before climbing back into the cab. Later, downtown near the bar where the neon sign buzzed even in daylight, a different kind of greeting waited. A man in his 40s, face ruddy and eyes glassy, lurched out as Walter carried a crate toward a side door. Alcohol clung to him like a second coat. "Hey, grocery man," the stranger called, voice too loud for the narrow street. "Got anything in there for me?" Walter didn't break stride, but he felt the familiar prickle at the base of his neck. Before he could answer, Ranger had moved. The shepherd slid from the truck and came to stand between Walter and the man, body loose but solid, head level, eyes fixed. He didn't snarl, didn't bare teeth. He simply existed there like a line someone would be wise not to cross. The drunk man's gaze dropped to the dog and lingered there, reading something in that steady amber stare. "Didn't know you had a cop with you," he muttered, stepping back with a half-hearted chuckle. All right. Walter nodded once in acknowledgement and finished his delivery. When he turned, Ranger was still there, glancing back over his shoulder as if to make sure they were done with this patch of rough water before walking beside him to the truck. By the time the last box was delivered, the gray of the sky had deepened toward purple. Streetlights glowed more brightly against the gathering dusk, and the windows of the Maple Ridge family diner spilled warm yellow onto the sidewalk. It was the sort of place that smelled of coffee and frying onions, with a bell on the door that rang the same way, whether it was noon rush or late-night lull. Walter found his hand steering the truck toward it without much conscious thought, the envelope still lying between him and Ranger like an extra passenger. Inside, the diner was 3/4 empty, the dinner crowd already dwindling. A row of booths lined the windows, and a long counter ran the opposite wall. Chrome stools worn smooth by decades of elbows and stories. Behind the counter, wiping down a coffee pot with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this for more years than she cared to count, stood Martha Lane. Martha looked to be somewhere in her early 60s, sturdy in the way of women who had lifted more than their share of heavy trays and heavy days. Her gray hair was pulled back into a low bun at the nape of her neck, wisps escaping around her face. Lines curved around her mouth and eyes, not unkindly, as if she'd frowned plenty but laughed enough to balance it. Her uniform, a pale pink blouse and dark slacks, hung a little looser than it might have once, but there was nothing frail about her. Her blue eyes were bright, sharp, and always busy, tracking which customer needed a refill, which plate was ready, which teenager was about to sneak out without leaving enough tip. "Evening, Walter," she called as the bell announced him. Her gaze dropped to the envelope in his hand and the set of his shoulders. "You look like a man who needs something stronger than our coffee, and all I've got is coffee, so sit." He slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl creaking under his weight. Ranger settled obediently beneath the table, stretching out so that his side pressed against Walter's boots. The shepherd's presence grounded him between the cool glass of the window and the warm hum of the diner. Walter laid the envelope on the table and stared at it as if it might decide to speak first. Martha came over with a mug already in hand, filling it from the pot she carried. Up close, she caught the faint tremor in his fingers as he reached for the cup. She didn't mention it. Instead, she set the coffee down and nudged it slightly closer. "On the house," she said, voice softer now. "You can pay me back by telling me if I need to call a lawyer or a doctor." He let out a breath that could have been a laugh if it hadn't been so thin. "Lawyer," he answered. "Got this thing today." His hand brushed the envelope. "Farm paperwork, I guess. Briggs' place." Martha's brows lifted just a fraction. "Your folks' old farm out on County 12? "Used to be," he said. It surprised him how easily the next part came out, like a splinter finally pushed free. "My brother kept it. We haven't spoken in over 20 years. She slid into the opposite side of the booth without asking, the vinyl sighing under her. For a moment she simply looked at him, the way someone might look at a wound to see how deep it went. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand lightly on his wrist, just above the old watch. Her palm was warm, the touch firm enough to be real, gentle enough not to trap. "Not everybody gets a second chance with blood, Mr. Briggs," she said quietly. "Most of us don't." Under the table, Ranger let out a long, low sigh, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but ears still angled up toward their voices. Walter glanced down at the dog's back, then at the envelope, its flap still neatly sealed along one edge, its weight oddly disproportionate to its size. He wrapped his fingers around the cooling coffee mug, feeling the tremor in them start up again, and wondered, not for the first time that day, if what waited inside was just land and legal words, or if somewhere in all that paper, there might also be the last things his brother had ever meant to say to him, arriving at a table in a small-town diner several years too late. By late afternoon the next day, the sky over Maple Ridge had traded its heavy gray for a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that made bare tree branches look like dark veins against the light. Walter drove with both hands steady on the wheel, the old truck humming along County Road 12 as if it knew the way without him. Beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat. The shepherd's ears pricked, nose working at the cold air leaking in around the window. The envelope from the lawyer lay folded in Walter's jacket pocket now. He didn't need to see the words again to feel them. They had done their job. They had brought him here. The stand of maples that guarded the lane to the old farm rose ahead, their branches mostly stripped, a few stubborn leaves hanging on in scraps of rust and gold. For years, Walter had driven past this spot, eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending he didn't feel the pull in his chest. Today, his hands moved almost of their own accord. He eased off the gas, flipped the blinker that no one but the trees would see, and turned the wheel. Gravel crunched under the tires, louder than he remembered, as the truck eased down the narrow lane swallowed by weeds. Ranger shifted his weight to stay balanced, his gaze swinging from the windshield to Walter's profile and back again, as if checking that both road and man remained in one piece. The farmhouse came into view around a low curve. 2 stories of weathered gray siding, the once white trim dulled by years of sun and neglect. The roof shingles had gone silver, patched here and there where someone, his brother, no doubt, had fought the losing battle against time. The wraparound porch sagged slightly at one corner, boards creaking as the wind moved across them. Windows stared blankly, some with curtains still hanging, faded to ghost colors. The red barn behind the house had lost much of its paint, revealing raw wood that had grayed in the elements. But it still stood square against the fields stretching out behind it. Walter parked near the front steps and cut the engine. For a few moments, he didn't move. His fingers rested on the steering wheel, knuckles pale, and his heartbeat thudded slow and heavy in his ears. He could almost see a younger version of himself ghosting across the yard, shoulders stiff in a too new uniform, voice raised too high as he shouted words he could not now take back. Somewhere behind that memory, his father's deeper tone, his brother's tight, hurt anger, the slam of a door. He'd left with his duffel slung over one shoulder and the conviction that he was right. Years had eroded the conviction and left only the leaving. Ranger broke the stillness with a soft whine, the sound low and questioning. The dog leaned forward, bumping his nose lightly against Walter's arm. "Yeah," Walter said, voice rough. "We're here." He opened the door. The cold bit at his cheeks as he stepped out, boots crunching on the gravel. Ranger jumped down, beside him, nails clicking, then fell into step half a pace ahead, not pulling, not pushing, just there. They climbed the porch together, each footfall drawing a complaint from the tired wood. Walter fished a key from his pocket. The same key, polished by years of habit, that had not once touched this lock since he'd stormed away. His brother must have kept the hardware unchanged all this time. The thought made something twist inside him. The key turned with reluctant stiffness. When he pushed the door open, the smell rolled out to meet them. Dust, old wood, a faint clinging echo of cooking and smoke that had soaked into the walls decades ago. Light slipped in through the front windows, filtered and soft, catching motes of dust that stirred in the cold air. Walter stepped over the threshold and felt the floor give a familiar, complaining creak under his weight, as if the house itself were waking up after a long sleep. The front room was smaller than he remembered, and larger at the same time. The furniture was mostly where it had always been. The worn sofa under the window, the heavy oak coffee table scarred with rings from glasses and plates. The bookshelf his father had built along one wall. Now everything wore a thin gray coat. A framed photograph of his parents on their wedding day still sat on the mantel, their younger faces dimmed but recognizable. His father broad-shouldered in a suit that never quite fit. His mother with her dark hair pinned up, eyes bright with something he hadn't understood when he was a boy. On the coffee table lay a neat stack of manila folders, their corners squared, and beside them, a metal tin the size of a shoebox, its blue paint chipped and flaking. The folders bore the imprint of the law office whose letter had dragged him here, their labels typed and practical. The tin had no label at all, only a latch that had lost most of its shine. Walter moved toward the table as if approaching something that might startle. Ranger stayed close, sniffing the air, then the legs of the furniture, as if cataloging all the old scents trapped in the room. When Walter reached the table, he brushed dust from the top folder with the back of his hand and flipped it open. Inside were copies of documents he only half saw. The farm's survey map, tax records, the will that named him heir because his brother had run out of time, and there was no one else with the name Briggs left to grant it to. Between two folders lay a single envelope, thinner than the rest. His name was handwritten this time, Walt. In a firm, slightly slanted script he knew at once. His brother's handwriting had always leaned to the right, like a man striding uphill. Walter's throat tightened. He sat slowly on the edge of the couch, the springs sighing beneath him, and slid a finger under the flap. The letter inside was only a few pages, written in blue ink that had faded a bit along the creases. His brother did not waste words on apology. That wasn't his way. Instead, he named things plainly. He wrote about the farm, about how the work had gotten harder, about the cancer that had settled into his bones and would not be argued with. He wrote that there was no one left here now but the land and the ghosts and a box he'd hung on to because their father had told him to. "Dad wrote to you, you know," one line said. "Kept at it after you stopped writing back. Told me if anything happened to him, those words were yours to deal with. I never could bring myself to toss them. Figured if you ever came home, you should be the one to decide whether they live or die." Beneath that, near the end, another paragraph. "There's more than his stuff in there now. Life kept happening, even without you. I wrote you a few times myself. Never mailed those either. Seemed foolish to talk to a mailbox. But I kept the habit. Wrote when your boy got sick, when things went bad. Wrote when she left, and when..." The line broke, started again in a firmer hand. "You've got a granddaughter, Walt. Name's Claire. She's a good kid. Lives in town these days, goes by her mama's name, Thompson. If you happen to cross her path, try not to screw it up twice." The letter ended shortly after that, with a scrawled signature and one last sentence that looked like he'd had to force the pen across the page. "House keys are where they always were." Walter set the letter down with care, fingers numb. The house seemed quieter than before. The tick of the old wall clock in the hall, suddenly too loud. Ranger had come to sit directly in front of him, head tilted, amber eyes searching his face. The dog huffed once, then shifted his attention to the metal tin, sniffing along its edge before giving a tiny sneeze at the dust. "Yeah," Walter murmured, more to the room than to the dog. "Guess we're not done yet." He reached for the tin, the metal cold beneath his palm. The latch lifted with a stiff little pop, and the lid creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, stacked in uneven layers, lay envelopes the color of old cream, their corners soft, some tied in bundles with string gone brittle with age. Most were addressed in his father's broader, blockier hand. Walter Briggs, U.S. Army, with bases and APO numbers that mapped the geography of his 20s. A few, nearer the top, bore his brother's slanted script. None of them had stamps. He picked one at random from near the middle of the stack. The return address on the corner was the farm's. The date was from a year he knew too well, the same year he'd gotten the call about his wife collapsing, about hospital corridors and whispered words he'd been too far away to hear in person. His father's handwriting inside was rough but determined. He wrote about the weather and the harvest first, in that old way of men who talked about the safe things before circling toward the pain. Then the words shifted. He wrote about Walter's wife, about tests and treatments and not wanting to worry him until they knew for sure. He wrote clumsily about prayer. He wrote about a little boy who had his father's eyes and his own stubbornness, still waiting by the window for his dad to come home on leave. The last line of that letter was underlined twice. "We are not mad at you, son. We just want you to come home while there's still time. Walter's vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the next envelope he opened cut no softer. This one was in his brother's hand, years later, after the funeral he'd missed, after the divorce papers had come without warning. His brother wrote about the boy then, about a sickness that wouldn't let go, about hospital bills, about how anger didn't keep anyone warm at night. The words grew shorter, tighter, as if written between chores, between breaths. Another letter spoke of a funeral, of small hands stilled, of a grave Walter had never stood beside. Yet another, dated years later, spoke of a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes who asked too many questions and loved to ride in the front of the truck on delivery days. Claire Thompson is trouble in the best way, his brother had written. Stubborn like you, soft like her grandma, lives over in the mobile home park now. We're doing what we can. Claire Thompson. The name snagged in Walter's mind like a hook. He knew it. Not from this dusty room, but from ink and paper of a different kind. The name on the grocery account for lot number 12 at the Maple Ridge Mobile Home Park. The one with the squeaky steps and the little girl who sometimes peeked from behind the curtain when he dropped off bags at the door. His hand went cold around the letter. Ranger nudged his knee, then leaned into him, a solid, living weight in a room full of ghosts. Walter stared at the looping letters of his granddaughter's name and felt the floor tilt under him, caught between the old vow that he was better off alone and a new, terrifying thought. That family had been standing a few feet away from him all this time, while he hid behind a steering wheel and a familiar route. That night, the lights of Maple Ridge looked softer than usual through the truck's windshield, halos of yellow and white smearing slightly on the glass, as Walter turned off the main road and into the gravel lot of the mobile home park. The air had turned sharp with evening cold, the kind that settled into his knuckles and made the old scars on his hands ache. He killed the engine and the world slid into a quieter hum. Distant highway noise, a television muffled through a thin wall, the tink-tink of someone's wind chime arguing with the breeze. Beside him, Ranger sat alert on the passenger seat, ears pricked, breath fogging the glass in slow, steady clouds. Row after row of narrow homes lined the lane, each with its little bit of life tacked on. Plastic chairs, a tricycle, a potted plant fighting the season. Walter's eyes found Lot 12 easily. He'd been delivering groceries there for months. The curtains in the front window were thin, patterned with faded blue flowers. Through them, he could make out the shapes of two people at a small table, a woman and a boy. Their faces turned toward each other in that way people did when dinner was more than just food. Warm light spilled around them, turning the steam from their plates into a faint halo. He had never really looked before. Not like this. He'd set bags on the steps, knocked, waited for a voice through the door, sometimes caught a glimpse of a shadow moving inside. Now, with his headlights off, he sat and watched as if the glass between them was a movie screen showing a life he'd missed. The woman looked to be in her late 20s, maybe 30 at most, with dark hair pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head, a few strands falling around her face. Her profile showed a straight nose, a determined chin, eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled at the little boy. She was not fragile, but there was a tiredness in the way her shoulders rounded between laughs, like someone who had carried more than her share and was still willing to make room for joy. The boy looked to be 5 or 6, small but wiry, with a mop of brown hair that refused to lie flat. Even from this distance, Walter could see the way his hands moved when he talked, the way he leaned forward, utterly sure the woman across from him would listen. At one point, the kid dropped something. Walter could just make out the shape of a dented toy truck skittering across the table, The boy let out a delighted laugh, chasing it with both hands. Ranger's ears flicked, and he gave a soft, questioning woof, as if greeting that small burst of happiness. "Easy, boy," Walter murmured automatically, though his own throat felt anything but easy. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers curled around the cracked leather. In his pocket, the letter that had named Claire Thompson pressed lightly against his chest each time he breathed. Claire. The woman at the table. His granddaughter. The syllables of the word felt strange in his mind, as if they belonged to somebody else's story. He could knock. The distance between him and that thin metal door couldn't be more than 30 yards. He had crossed farther under fire. He had run longer distances with more weight on his back than any envelope of old words. He imagined stepping out, Ranger's nails tapping at his heels, the crunch of gravel, his knuckles on the door. Imagined the woman opening it. Suspicion first, then the polite, guarded curiosity of a person who lived on the edge of town and the edge of just getting by. "Evening, ma'am," he'd say. "Name's Walter Briggs. I deliver your groceries, and I'm also—" The rest jammed up somewhere behind his ribs. Inside, the boy jammed his fork into a pile of something that might have been mac and cheese, lifting it high and making a face that made the woman laugh. Her laugh reached even here, a bright sound, muffled by walls but still sharp enough to cut through his indecision. Ranger gave another soft sound, almost a whine this time, and shifted closer to the window, watching the small scene as if it were important, as if the pattern of that ordinary meal held some answer. Walter stayed where he was. His heart pressed against his sternum like it wanted out, but his legs did not move. Old habits, the ones that told him to hold the line, to stay in his lane, to keep his mess to himself, anchored him to the seat. After a while, the dishes were cleared. The shapes inside the trailer blurred as lights clicked off one by one. He stared a moment longer at the dark window, then turned the key. The engine shuddered to life. Ranger looked from the home to Walter and back again before settling down with a sigh, as if filing this retreat away with 100 others. The next morning, the sky was clearer, as if the weather had decided overnight to pretend winter wasn't coming. Walter loaded the truck in the alley behind Grover's, his movements slower than usual, the red and black jacket hanging a little looser from his shoulders. Earl made a joke about him looking like he'd seen a ghost. Walter deflected with a grunt and a remark about bad coffee. Ranger climbed into the cab without needing to be told, circling once before lying down with his head on his paws, eyes following every small motion of Walter's hands. He'd just finished securing the last crate when the passenger door opened without warning. Ranger's head snapped up, muscles tensing, but the dog relaxed a notch when he recognized the figure climbing in. Martha Lane stood on the running board for a second, steadying herself with one hand on the frame. Up close in daylight, she looked much the same as she did under the diner's fluorescent lights. Early 60s, solid build, gray hair tucked back, lines on her face etched by both worry and laughter. Today she wore a heavy cardigan over her work blouse, and there was a stubborn set to her jaw that said she'd already had this argument in her head and won. "Morning to you too," Walter said, blinking. "You lose your car somewhere?" "Car's fine," Martha replied, settling onto the bench seat with a small huff. Ranger sniffed her hand automatically, tail giving a tentative thump before he decided she was allowed, and laid his head between them. "My sister's out past the park, and I figured since you're already headed that way, I might save myself the price of gas, and you the trouble of pretending nothing's wrong." Walter gripped the steering wheel, the tendons in his hands standing out. "Who says something's wrong?" Martha gave him a look that could have curdled fresh cream. "Please, you came in last night looking like somebody kicked over your gravestone. You barely touched your pie, and Briggs, You do not ignore Pi unless the world is ending. She glanced down at the faint bulge of paper in his jacket pocket. I take it that tin box of letters did more than collect dust. He stared at the windshield for a long moment, the truck idling. Finally, he eased it into gear and pulled onto the street. Words came slow. He wasn't practiced at saying them out loud. There was more than I expected, he admitted. My old man wrote. My brother. They kept track of things. His throat worked. Turns out my family kept going without me. Turns out I've got a granddaughter in town. Martha didn't gasp, didn't make any fuss. She simply folded her hands in her lap and let the information sit between them like a third passenger. The Thompson girl? She asked after a stretch of silence. Lot 12? He shot her a quick, startled glance. You knew? I know who buys what at the diner, she said. And I know who you deliver to. You forget how small this town is. I also know the look of a man who's just realized the universe is a lot smaller and a lot bigger than he thought. She shifted, turning so she could see his face better. What happened, Walter? Before all this? With you and your boy? The road unspooled ahead of them. Storefronts, the school, the turn toward the park. Walter followed it on instinct, his mind traveling a longer, rougher distance. I came back from the sand full of noise, he said slowly. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't stand quiet. Everything felt like it was about to blow, even when it wasn't. My kid. He was just a teenager. Mouthy, smart. I tried to straighten him out the way I thought a man should. Rules for everything. Curfews, chores, yelling when he slipped up. I told myself I was keeping him safe. His grip tightened on the wheel until his knuckles whitened. Truth is, I was just scared. Scared of losing him, scared of being a lousy father, scared of all the things I saw following me home. He left after a big fight, slung a backpack over his shoulder, told me he was done being treated like a soldier, and walked out. I figured he'd cool off, come back. Instead, I got a call. His voice roughened. Some stupid argument at a parking lot. Wrong kid with a gun. By the time I got there, the paramedics were zipping the bag. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Walter's arm, a warm weight anchoring him to the present. Martha's face softened, the lines around her mouth deepening. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That's a kind of hurt you don't walk off. Walter swallowed hard. After that, his mom left too. Couldn't stand the sight of me, I guess. Maybe she was right. I was the one who'd been shouting. I was the one who didn't go after him fast enough. He let out a harsh breath. I decided the best thing I could do for anyone was stay away. So I did. For years. He glanced at her. And now, there's this girl. Claire. His girl. Living in a tin box at the edge of town while I drop groceries on her steps and pretend I'm just some delivery guy. They had reached the turnoff for the mobile home park. Walter slowed, signal ticking loudly in the cab. Martha watched the rows of trailers slide into view, eyes narrowing. You know, she said, when my husband died, people kept telling me all the things I should have done differently. Call the doctor sooner, make him eat better, nag him about his checkups. I spent a lot of nights arguing with ghosts. Took me a long time to realize none of that noise changed the fact that he was gone. The only thing I could still do was not waste whatever love I had left on the living. She reached over and tapped his wrist, just above the old watch. You can't save the ones who already left, Walter. None of us can. But you can decide whether you're going to show up for the kid who's still here asking the world for help. He pulled the truck to a stop at the head of the lane, same place he'd parked the night before. Lot 12 sat halfway down, a plastic tricycle tipped on its side in the narrow strip of yard. As if on cue, the trailer's door opened, and the woman from the window, Claire, stepped out, pulling a worn gray sweater tight around herself against the breeze. Up close, he could see more clearly. Late 20s, medium height, a little too thin, dark hair escaping its knot, brown eyes that scanned the world like she'd learned not to trust it entirely, but hadn't given up on it either. There was a small, faint scar near her left eyebrow, a pale crescent that reminded him inexplicably of his son. She walked toward the truck with a quick, purposeful stride, the practiced pace of someone who counted every minute between jobs and childcare. Her hands were roughened, knuckles red from work and cold. When she reached the side of the truck, Ranger's head popped out the open window, nose working the air. Claire's features softened instantly. "Well, hey there, handsome," she said, her voice low and a little hoarse, like she didn't get enough sleep. She lifted a hand, palm open. Ranger sniffed, then pressed his nose into her fingers, tail wagging in a slow, friendly sweep. After a beat, he licked once across her knuckles, a gentle, deliberate gesture. "Sorry," Walter said, finding his voice. "He thinks everybody's here to see him instead of the groceries." Claire smiled, quick and real, the kind that lit her whole face for a heartbeat. "He's not wrong," she replied. "My little guy talks about the big dog from the truck more than he talks about the food." She glanced toward the trailer, where a small figure now peered from behind the curtain, waving shyly. "I'm Claire, by the way. I don't think I ever caught your name." "Walter," he said. The word came out rougher than he intended. "Walter Briggs. I run deliveries for Grover's. Just the guy who brings the milk." "Just the guy who brings the milk," she repeated, as if testing the shape of it. "Well, my boy thinks you're Santa Claus with a pickup, so thanks for that." She reached for the receipt he held out, their fingers brushing for a second, callous against callous. "If they ever let me tip you in more than change and gratitude, I will." Martha cleared her throat softly from the passenger seat, but said nothing. Ranger, still leaning into Claire's hand, flicked his gaze from her face to Walter's, then back again, as if tracking some invisible line between them. Walter watched the young woman turn back toward the trailer, watched the little boy fling the door open wider to greet her, watched for the second time in 24 hours as a small family gathered around an ordinary evening. His chest felt too tight, full of words he didn't know how to shape. There was one sentence burning so hot, it seemed to sear the back of his tongue. 7 simple words he had never imagined himself saying. "I'm not just the guy who brings milk." But as the door closed and the thin curtains fell back into place, he sat frozen behind the wheel, fingers gripping it so hard his knuckles blanched, and he could not yet tell whether he would ever find the courage to say the rest. "I'm your grandfather." The first storm of winter rolled into Maple Ridge on a Thursday night, dragging a wall of black cloud over the town like someone pulling a heavy blanket over a sleeping child. By the time Walter finished his last delivery at Grover's and helped Earl pull the plywood sheets across the big front windows, the wind was already up, shoving at the glass, making the old neon sign outside creak on its chain. Rain came hard and slantwise, rattling on the awning and pooling in the low spots of Main Street. The weather radio on the counter spat out a steady stream of warnings. Gusts, flash flooding, downed power lines. Each one another reminder that thin walls and old wiring didn't have much to stand on in a town held together with duct tape and goodwill. "Lines out at the park are older than I am," Earl muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. The man was in his late 60s, belly rounded, hair retreating but eyes sharp as ever. If anything's gonna blow, it'll be out there. Folks don't got much to fall back on. He looked over at Walter, who stood with his red and black jacket zipped up to his throat, Ranger pressed close to his leg. You mind taking a spin through after we button up here? Just eyeball things. If somebody's in trouble, call it in. Sheriff's spread thin tonight. Walter glanced at the rain-blurred window, then down at the shepherd at his side. Ranger was standing taller than usual, ears pricked, nostrils flaring as if he could smell the storm through concrete and glass. Yeah, Walter said quietly. We can do that. It wasn't heroics, he told himself. It was just what you did when you had a truck, a full tank of gas, and the kind of training that made you see danger before some folks even smelled it. They finished locking the place up, Earl clapping him on the shoulder before disappearing into the rain with his own battered sedan. Walter and Ranger jogged the short distance to the pickup, both of them soaked by the time they slammed the doors. Inside the cab, the world narrowed to the drum of rain on the roof and the rhythmic swish of the wipers as he pulled away from Main and headed toward the low lights on the edge of town where the mobile home park sat. The storm seemed to thicken out there, as if the open fields gave it room to run. Wind buffeted the truck hard enough to make it shimmy in its lane. Lightning flashed far off, turning the sky an eerie white for a split second before plunging it back into darkness. Walter kept his hand steady on the wheel, eyes sweeping the road for fallen branches, flooded dips. Beside him, Ranger had braced his front paws against the dash, head lifted, nose working overtime. The shepherd let out a soft whine, then another, his muscles coiling under his short, dense coat. You smell something? Walter asked, though the answer was plain in the dog's posture. There was no sharp edge of panic in it yet, but something had snagged his attention. Walter cracked his side window an inch despite the rain. At first, all he got was cold, wet air and the faint sourness of the drainage ditch. Then, beneath it, a thin thread of something acrid, hot metal maybe, or burned leaves. He frowned, rolling the glass back up. Probably a transformer, he muttered, more for himself than for Ranger. Lines go, things pop. They turned into the park's gravel lot, tires slipping a little in the mud. Some of the trailers were dark. Others flickered with candlelight or the glow of battery lanterns. The power had gone out here before. People knew the drill. Walter rolled slowly past the first row, scanning for anything out of place. A door hanging open, someone standing outside in pajamas, waving for help. The storm made it hard to see more than a few lots ahead. Ranger suddenly barked, sharp and loud in the confined space, front paws thumping against the dash. His body was angled toward the far end of the park, the last row of homes where the land dipped slightly toward the creek. He barked again, then let out a low, urgent growl, nails scrabbling as he spun and planted himself with his front paws on the back of the bench seat, nose aimed straight out the rear window. Okay, Walter said, heart rate ticking up. He shifted into reverse, backing up until he could swing down the side lane that led toward the final cluster of trailers. The cheap ones. The ones people took when they didn't have the luxury of being picky. Claire's lot was down there. Lot 12. As they drew closer, the faint smell he'd caught earlier sharpened into something unmistakable. Smoke that didn't belong to cigarettes or overcooked dinner. Smoke with a bitter, electric tang. He saw the glow before he saw the flames. A pulsing orange light flickered against the low clouds, painting the undersides of the raindrops as they fell. Turning the final corner, he hit the brakes, the truck sliding a foot before coming to a stop. A trailer 2 doors down from Claire's was on fire, windows blown out, flames licking from the roof seams despite the rain. The thin metal walls buckled and popped as heat gnawed at them. Black smoke billowed into the wind, driving sideways, curling around the neighboring units. Claire's home sat in the line of it, close enough that the side paneling had already begun to char, paint blistering. Her windows were dark. No porch light, no flicker of movement behind the thin curtains. The only illumination came from the hellish glow next door, turning her door handle into a dull, gleaming ember. "Damn it," Walter breathed. He grabbed for the radio clipped to the dash, thumb punching the emergency button. Static answered it first. Then the distant crackle of dispatch, already juggling calls. He gave the address, voice clipped and clear the way they'd taught him years ago. "Mobile home fire, active and spreading. Possible occupants trapped. Need fire and EMS. Repeat, fire and EMS. Priority." "Units, NASA. Route," came the reply, thin and tinny. Downed lines reported across town. Response may be delayed. Delayed. The word lodged like a stone in his chest. He glanced at the burning shell of the neighboring trailer. A section of roof groaned and collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Some of them landed on the narrow strip of wet grass between the two homes and hissed out. But others clung stubbornly to the eaves of Claire's place, nibbling at the cheap shingles. Ranger barked again, frantic now. The dog lunged toward the passenger door when Walter opened it, hitting the ground at a run the moment his paws found mud. The rain had turned the lane into a slick mess. But Ranger barely seemed to notice, cutting a straight line toward the dark door of Lot 12. Walter followed. Boots sliding, heat slapping at his face as he passed the burning unit. The sound was deafening up close. A hungry roar, punctuated by the occasional crack of something structural giving way. He reached Claire's small porch and hammered his fist against the metal door. "Claire," he shouted, voice hoarse. "Claire, it's Walter from Grover's. You in there?" No answer. He hit the door again, shoulder braced, the metal rattling in its frame. Inside, nothing moved. No footsteps, no muffled voices, no crying child. Only the low thunder of the storm and the high, angry hiss of fire eating its way closer. Smoke was already sliding along the edge of the roof above him, curling down in gray fingers that stung his eyes and burned his throat. The heat pressed against his back from the neighboring blaze, so intense it felt like standing too close to an open oven. Ranger wasn't at the door with him anymore. The dog had veered to the side of the trailer, nails raking at the wet earth as he jumped up, paws slamming against the one small window that hadn't yet turned into a sheet of flame-streaked glass. "Ranger," Walter coughed, stumbling after him. The shepherd's body was silhouetted in the firelight, muscles bunched, teeth bared in a sharp bark. He kept leaping up, hitting the siding with his front feet, then dropping and launching again, as if sheer stubbornness could break the wall. Between barks, he let out a different sound. A high, keening whine Walter had only heard once or twice on missions long ago. A sound he'd come to associate with trapped life on the other side of danger. He pressed his face close to the window, cupping his hands around his eyes to cut the glare. Inside, through the wavering shadows, he thought he saw the faint outline of movement. A small shape, low to the ground, near what might have been the couch. Or it could have been a trick of the light, some pattern of shadow and furniture and fear. The glass was already hot under his palms. Somewhere behind him, a siren wailed. Distant, struggling against the wind and the rain and the thundering in his own ears. It was coming, but not fast enough. Not nearly fast enough. Walter stepped back, chest heaving, jacket already beating with droplets of water and sparks. The last time he'd stood this close to heat and smoke, he'd been in a different country, different uniform, shouting different names into chaos. That time, he'd hesitated, just long enough for the worst to happen. The weight of that moment had never left his bones. Now, with Ranger throwing himself again and again at the fragile skin of the home where his granddaughter slept, with fire greedily chewing its way toward them and help still minutes away, the old fear rose up with the old training, and he felt the whole of his life narrowing to a single, brutal question. Was he going to stay outside and pray this time? Or was he finally going to step into the flames for the family that didn't yet know his name? Walter didn't wait for the sirens to grow any louder. The question that had frozen him outside other doors all those years ago cracked and fell away, under the heat pressing at his back now. He yanked his red and black jacket up over his mouth and nose, grabbed the doorknob of Claire's trailer, and drove his heel into the panel just above the latch. The cheap metal gave with a screech, folding inward. Smoke rolled out like a living thing, hot and greasy, clawing at his eyes. "Ranger, find them!" he barked, the old command snapping free from some buried corner of muscle memory. "Find!" The shepherd shot past him, disappearing into the gray. Inside, the air was a choking soup of heat and chemicals, stinging his skin where it touched. Walter dropped low, one arm over his face, the other hand skimming along the wall as he followed the sound of Ranger's nails skittering on the floor and the sharp staccato barks that answered the darkness. Shadows leaped and twisted in the jittering light from the fire outside. The small living room he'd seen only through glass became a warped nightmare version of itself. Furniture hulking in strange shapes, the couch a dim mound, toys strewn like landmines underfoot. There, a ragged cough, high and thin, somewhere near the floor. Ranger had already gotten there before him. The dog's body was hunched, angled sideways, shoulders braced against something low. As Walter crawled closer, he saw the boy curled up between the coffee table and the couch, arms wrapped around a battered toy truck, eyes huge and streaming. Ranger had wedged himself between the child and a sagging bookshelf, taking the brunt of the falling debris on his own back. A plank lay across the shepherd's hindquarters, and he grunted once in pain, but didn't move away from the boy. "I've got you, kiddo," Walter rasped, shoving the board aside. He scooped the boy up, light as a bundle of sticks, feeling the rattle of sobs against his chest. "Hang on to me. Squeeze tight." The child latched his arms around Walter's neck with surprising strength, coughing into his shoulder. Ranger stepped in front of them, lowered his head, and began to move back the way they'd come, checking every step before committing his weight, tail low and steady. "Claire!" Walter shouted, voice breaking on her name. "Claire!" The answer came from down the narrow hallway, a faint, ragged sound that might have been his name, or just another cough. He turned toward it without thinking, following Ranger's lead. The dog darted ahead, then back, casting anxious looks over his shoulder as if to say, "This way, keep moving." The bedroom door at the end of the hall stood half open, the space beyond filled with thicker smoke. Walter pushed it the rest of the way and stumbled in. Claire lay near the bed, half on the floor, one hand still clutching the edge of the mattress, as if she'd been trying to stand when the smoke took her down. Her face was ashy, lips parted, breaths shallow and rapid. "Got you," Walter muttered, more to himself than to her. "I've got you." He lowered the boy onto the bed for a heartbeat, wrapped his arms under Claire's shoulders and knees, and lifted. She was heavier than the child, but lighter than he'd expected, all wiry strength and worry worn thin. His knees protested, but he straightened. Smoke clawed at his throat, heat gnawed at the back of his neck. Somewhere behind them, part of the trailer's frame moaned and gave way with a crash. "Out!" he croaked. "Ranger, out!" The shepherd didn't hesitate. He bounded back into the hallway, then stopped and looked over his shoulder to be sure they were following, barking once, sharply. Walter hauled Claire's weight higher against his chest, hooked the boy's small hand in his jacket so the child could cling to him from behind, and lurched after the dog. The world narrowed to the patch of floor just ahead of his boots. The white blur of Ranger's tail, the burning in his lungs. The front door had become just a shape in the smoke, a rectangle of marginally lighter gray. He aimed for it like a man aims for a distant shore. They burst into the open air in a tangle of limbs and coughs. The cold rain hit his face like a slap, washing streaks of soot down his cheeks. Someone shouted. Distant figures, neighbors maybe, or the first responders finally cresting the hill, ran toward them. Walter went to his knees in the mud, lowering Claire as gently as he could, then leaning to set the boy beside her. The child immediately scrambled back to Ranger, burying his face in the shepherd's chest. The dog's right foreleg trembled, fur singed and skin angry red beneath, but he curled his body around the boy, licking at his hair in clumsy, reassuring strokes. Red and blue lights strobed across the scene as the fire truck squealed to a stop, followed by an ambulance. A paramedic in his 30s, compact and quick-moving, with close-cropped blonde hair and a jaw bristling with end-of-shift stubble, dropped to his knees beside Claire. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, slipping an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. Her eyelids fluttered. Another medic, a woman around 40 with dark braids pulled back tight and calm, steady eyes, moved to the boy, checking his pulse, murmuring, "You're okay, buddy. You're a tough little man." Someone threw a blanket around Walter's shoulders. He hadn't realized he was shaking until the coarse fabric settled there, trapping the heat that still radiated from his skin. His chest ached from coughing, and every breath tasted like burnt plastic. One of the medics, he couldn't see which, pressed a mask into his hand. "You too, sir." Deep breaths. In the chaos of hoses snaking past and shouted orders, Claire's gaze found him. Her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy, but there was a sharpness behind the fog now. She pushed weakly at the mask, dragging it aside just enough to rasp. How did you know we were in there?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Why were you even here?" Walter stared at her, the world tilting for a moment as the question settled. He could have lied. Said he was just doing rounds for the store. Said he saw the fire and did what anyone would. The easy answers lined up in his mind out of habit, the way soldiers line up at roll call. But something about the way she looked at him, bewildered, vulnerable, and yet refusing to look away, stripped them of their usefulness. I'll tell you," he managed. "I promise, just let them get you checked out first." The ride in the ambulance blurred into a series of bright images and jagged sounds. The slap of the double doors closing, the wail of the siren rising again, the rhythmic beep of monitors. Claire lay on the gurney, the boy tucked under one arm as far as the paramedics would allow, oxygen mask fogging with each breath. Walter sat on a narrow bench, blanket still around his shoulders. Ranger on the floor at his feet, head resting on his uninjured paw. A bandage had been wrapped hastily around the burned leg, white gauze already stained gray. Every time the truck lurched, the shepherd's tail thumped, as if to say, "Still here, still with you." At the hospital, they were peeled apart and sorted like puzzle pieces. Claire to one bay, the boy to another, Walter to a third. The ER was all bright white light and polished linoleum. Nurses in colorful scrubs moving with practiced efficiency. A doctor in her 50s, silver streaks in her dark hair and kind lines at the corners of her mouth. Checked his lungs, listened to his heartbeat, pronounced him singed, but not broken. "You're lucky," she said, scribbling something on a chart. "Another minute or two in there and you'd be coughing for weeks. Try not to make a habit of running into burning buildings, Mr. Briggs. He gave a hoarse half-laugh. I'll keep it off my to-do list. They wanted to keep him for observation. He insisted on sitting in the chair beside Claire's bed instead. Eventually, they relented, with the compromise that he keep the oxygen cannula under his nose and let them check his vitals every so often. Ranger lay under the foot of the gurney, his bandaged paws stretched out, tail thumping whenever anyone brushed past. A nurse brought him a bowl of water without being asked. "Hero gets a drink," she said with a small smile, then slipped away again. Claire dozed and woke in fits, the medication and adrenaline pulling her up and down. The boy had finally fallen asleep, curled on a second gurney pulled close, one small hand resting on Ranger's flank like he'd decided the dog was the safest island in the room. Sometime in the thin hours before dawn, the room fell quieter. The monitors still beeped, but more softly, like crickets instead of sirens. Claire blinked awake and turned her head toward Walter. Her voice was clearer now, if still rough. "You said you'd tell me," she whispered. "Why you were there. Why you looked at us like that." She swallowed. "Why you said my name like you'd been saying it for a long time." Walter's fingers twisted in the edge of the blanket. The words he'd rehearsed silently for years felt clumsy and oversized in his mouth. Ranger shifted, lifting his head, amber eyes flicking between man and woman, as if sensing that the real fire was in the space between their breaths now. "I had a son," Walter began, staring at his own hands. "A good kid, smart, stubborn. I brought the war home in my bones and took it out on him. Rules, shouting, making everything a battle because I didn't know how to stop fighting. One night I told him, if he wanted to leave, he should just go. So he did." His voice thinned. "Someone called later. There was a fight, a gun. I got there too late." He drew in a breath that scraped against his lungs. "He had a girl. You. I didn't know about you for a long time. Your uncle, my brother, kept track when I didn't deserve to. He wrote me letters I never picked up. When I finally did, there you were on the page. Claire, living in this town, deliveries from Grover's to Lot 12. He forced himself to look up into her wide, wet eyes. "I've known who you were for years. I've been too much of a coward to say it." Silence settled over the bed like another blanket. Claire's face crumpled, then steadied, tears sliding down into her hairline. The boy stirred in his sleep, pressing closer to Ranger. The dog shifted just enough to tuck his head nearer the child's hand, offering wordless comfort the way only animals can. "So, you've been watching us," she said eventually, voice shaking. "Dropping food on our steps, saying nothing. Letting me think you were just some delivery guy." "I told myself you'd be better off not knowing," Walter admitted. "That I'd only bring trouble. That you'd look at me and see the man who failed your father. Maybe you still will." His hands trembled as he leaned forward. "You can hate me for the rest of your life if you need to. I probably deserve that. But please, please don't let that little boy grow up thinking he belongs to no one. I don't have much left, but I have enough to stand beside him and say he's mine. I can't make the same mistake 3 times. The words hung there between them, heavy and fragile all at once, while Walter waited, heart pounding, for the verdict he wasn't sure he'd survive. By the time winter loosened its grip on Maple Ridge, the snow along the lane to the Briggs farm had surrendered to soft, shoe-sucking mud. The ruts Walter's old pickup had carved all season were now filled with meltwater that shivered at the slightest breeze, reflecting a pale sky and the bare arms of the maple trees. New tracks cut across that old mud now, small sneaker prints wandering side by side, with 4 clear paw marks, the pattern looping and circling in a language of play. From the porch, if you left the front door open a crack, you could hear a sound the house hadn't held in a very long time. A child's high, unself-conscious laughter, chased by the deeper, rhythmical thump of a German shepherd's tail against wood. Claire hadn't moved in all at once. Even now, weeks after the fire, she still spoke of the farm as "for now" and "just until they fix the park," her voice catching on the places where she'd almost say something more permanent and then pull back. The first day she arrived, she stepped out of the car with her shoulders tight and her overnight bag clutched like a shield, eyes cataloging every detail of the old house with the wary precision of someone who'd learned not to trust good things to last. Walter had watched from the porch in his red and black jacket, feeling too big for the space he occupied, like some clumsy piece of furniture that might topple if anyone came too close. He carried her boxes without comment, careful not to crowd her, careful to leave space, physical, emotional, for her to decide where to stand. She slept at first in the room that had been hastily cleared out at the end of the hall, the one with the view of the barn, while Walter kept to his old room downstairs off the kitchen. The house was big enough for distance, and yet small enough that every doorway seemed to frame some new, tentative crossing. The boy wandering into the kitchen in sock feet, hair sticking up, asking if there was more cereal. Claire standing in the back doorway at dusk, mug cupped in both hands, watching Ranger chase a wayward leaf across the yard. She didn't forgive with any grand speech. Instead, she built a kind of fragile truce out of small rules spoken plainly at the kitchen table. "We do this slow," she'd said, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "No surprises, no yelling. You don't get to decide things for us without asking. If I say I need space, you give it. We're not fixing everything in a day." Her eyes had been steady, even as the shadow of old hurt sat behind them. Walter had nodded, hands flat on the worn table. "Slow is fine," he'd answered. "Slow is more than I ever thought I'd get." Her son had his own timetable. Whatever wariness Claire carried, the boy seemed to have mislaid most of his. It took exactly one afternoon, one cartoon, and one very patient dog to promote Walter from Mr. Briggs from the store to Grandpa Wally. It happened on the sagging couch in the den, the television throwing soft colors against the walls. The boy had been drowsing, head searching for a pillow and finding Ranger's flank instead. The shepherd, leg still bandaged then, had huffed once at the extra weight, then resettled, chin on the boy's stomach like a sentry taking up post. Walter, passing by with a basket of laundry, had paused in the doorway, something in his chest loosening at the sight. "Grandpa Wally, can Ranger sleep in my room?" the boy had mumbled without opening his eyes, and the name had landed so simply in the air that no one dared disturb it. Claire had come in behind Walter, heard it, and instead of correcting her son, had just looked at Walter for a long moment before giving the smallest of nods. The boy got his wish. Ranger made his rounds between rooms at night, nails clicking softly on the hardwood, the house learning the comfort of his patrol. Martha appeared often enough that no one bothered pretending she was just stopping by after the first week. The widow from the diner arrived one Saturday with her gray hair tucked under a knit cap, a tray of still warm apple pie in one hand and a 5-gallon bucket of white paint in the other. "This place has good bones," she announced, eyeing the fence that sagged along the front of the property. "It's just forgotten how to hold its shoulders up." She was in her early 60s, sturdy in the way of women who'd carried more than their share of the world, with laugh lines that deepened when she squinted against the sun. Before Walter could argue, she had a brush in his hand and another in Claire's, and the three of them set to work. Ranger supervising from the shade and the boy helping, by dabbling small, enthusiastic streaks of paint on the lower boards. They broke for pie at the picnic table, the child chattering, Martha listening with the patience of a seasoned waitress who'd heard 1,000 stories and still believed each one mattered. It was Martha, later, who slid a folded flyer across the table, a printout about community suppers and support groups she'd seen in another town. "You've got land," she said softly, nodding toward the pasture. "I've got recipes. There are enough folks around here with more ghosts than groceries. We could give them a place to sit down, a place to be seen." The idea settled into the house like a new piece of furniture, awkward at first, then slowly becoming part of the landscape. Evenings found them at the kitchen table with notepads and coffee. Walter awkward over the logistics of parking and tables. Claire quietly practical about food allergies and kids' corners. Martha thinking aloud about inviting other veterans, other single parents, the ones whose stories no one asked to hear. Ranger dozed under the table, his bandaged leg gradually shedding its wrappings as pink skin gave way to new fur, a slightly darker patch that caught the light when he stretched. The boy made elaborate crayon drawings of how the barn could look with strings of lights and long tables. Walter pinned one of them to the fridge with the same reverence he'd once reserved for deployment orders. On a night when winter finally surrendered and the air held the first honest hint of spring, the 3 adults and 1 dog migrated to the front porch after dinner. The boards had been recently swept. Martha had insisted on a rug, something with color to break up the gray. The sky over the fields was smudged with the last of the sunset, thin streaks of pink dissolving into blue. Walter settled into his old chair, the familiar weight of his plaid jacket over his shoulders, and reached down to rest his hand on Ranger's leg. The fur there was shorter and a shade rougher, circling the scar like a ring. He stroked it gently, gratitude moving through his fingers. "You did good, soldier," he murmured. Ranger sighed, that deep, contented sound he saved for moments when everyone he cared about was within sight. On the opposite end of the porch, Claire sat with her son tucked against her side, a worn envelope open in her hands. The letter inside had been written in a cramped, uneven script. Her grandfather's hand, carefully kept all those years by Walter's brother. She read aloud slowly, stumbling over a word now and then when emotion thickened her voice. The letter spoke of mistakes and pride, of a son driven too hard, of a granddaughter known only through secondhand stories and a small school photo. The words were simple, almost clumsy, but they carried the weight of a man trying, in ink, to reach across a canyon he'd helped carve. The boy listened with the serious intensity of children hearing about "before I was born," thumb absently buried in Ranger's ruff. Every now and then he would look up at Walter, frowning in thought, as if fitting the story on the page to the man on the porch. Martha eased down onto the step beside Walter, her shoulder brushing his. She didn't say anything. She just let the contact sit there. A quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the bravest thing an old soldier could do was stay put. Her presence was solid and warm at his side, like a second cup of coffee on a cold morning or a hand on your back when you forgot how to walk into a crowded room. Walter watched Claire's profile in the lamplight, the way her expression softened on certain lines, tightened on others. He knew there were things in that letter he could never undo, apologies he couldn't sign his own name to and make right. The past was fixed in its own broken shape. But here, under this roof, on this porch, there were still chapters left that hadn't been written in anger or silence. Ranger lifted his head and looked up at him, eyes steady, as if checking to see if Walter understood. The dog's gaze slid then to the boy, to Claire, to Martha, and back again, making a slow circuit of the small circle of people gathered there. It Struck Walter that for all the uniforms he'd worn and orders he'd followed, it was this animal, scarred, loyal, uncomplicated, who'd been the one to drag him, paw by paw, toward the life he'd been too afraid to claim. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The ache in his chest remained, but it had changed texture, softened from a jagged wound into something more like an old bruise. Tender, but no longer defining every step. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let his voice carry just enough to reach the far end of the porch. "You know," he said, eyes on the muddy tracks leading away from the house and back again, "I spent a lot of years not saying what needed saying until it was too late." He swallowed, then turned his head toward the boy. "So, I'm gonna try and do better. I love you, kiddo. Both of you." Claire's eyes met his, wet but clear, and for the first time there was no flinch in them, only a tired, tentative kind of hope. The boy, never one to undercomplicate, grinned and snuggled closer into his mother's side, his free hand reaching out to pat Walter's knee like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ranger's tail thumped once, then twice, against the porch boards. The night settled around them, not as a closing door, but as a roof over a house that, after too many years of being empty, had finally remembered how it felt to be home. Sometimes God's miracles don't look like parted seas or thunder in the sky. Sometimes they look like a tired old veteran, a wary young mother, a brave little boy, and a scarred dog. All sitting together under one small roof, learning, slowly, clumsily, to say, "I love you," before it's too late. That, too, is grace. That, too, is God quietly stitching back together what pride and fear once tore apart. If this story touched a corner of your own life, if you have someone you still think about, still pray for, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about a time God gave you a second chance, or someone you still hope to forgive. If you'd like more stories like this, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who might need a gentle reminder that they are not alone. And as you go back to your own ordinary day, the dishes, the doctor's appointments, the phone calls you've been putting off, may the Lord watch over you and your family, soften the hard places in your heart, and bless you with the quiet miracle of one more chance to love while there is still time.